NATO leaders on Wednesday backed the big increase in the defense spending that US President Donald Trump had demanded and reinstated their commitment to defend each other from attacks. While Trump got what he wanted at the brief summit tailor-made for him, his NATO allies will be relieved that he continues to be committed to the fundamental principle of collective defense. NATO allies also reaffirmed their enduring support for Ukraine. DD India's Raghav Kumar Jha has more.
NATO leaders committed Wednesday to spend 5% of annual output on defense by 2035. Seen as vital to counter the threat from Russia and keep US President Donald Trump engaged with the alliance. In a joint statement, the 32 members of the alliance said, allies commit to invest 5% of GDP annually on core defense requirements as well as defense and security-related spending by 2035. As per the agreement, NATO members would spend 3.5% of GDP on core defense, such as troops and weapons, and 1.5% on broader defense-related measures such as cybersecurity, protecting pipelines, and adapting roads and bridges to handle heavy military vehicles. French President Emmanuel Macron told reporters that Europe will spend more on defense to be better equipped to face the Russian threat.
We are doing all of this, let me remind you, and put this back in the middle of discussions, because there is a Russian threat. And this is why we are all rearming ourselves, because this threat is at our borders.
US President Donald Trump hailed NATO's summit as a big success.
This was a tremendous summit, and I enjoyed it very much. And thank you. I stayed through every one of those speeches. Everyone.
The NATO allies stressed their unwavering commitment to mutual defense, a founding principle of the alliance that US President Donald Trump had appeared to question. The leaders in the summit declaration said, "We reaffirm our ironclad commitment to collective defense as enshrined in Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, that an attack on one is an attack on all." Hosting the meeting, NATO chief Mark Rutte asserted that it is a winning combination for North America and Europe and the most powerful defense alliance in world history.
We stand together, united in NATO, the most powerful defensive alliance in world history. History has shown that North America and Europe working together is a winning combination.
NATO allies declared Russia as a long-term threat to Euro-Atlantic security and reaffirmed their enduring support for Ukraine. On the other hand, the Kremlin accused NATO of being on the path of rampant militarization and portraying Russia as a fiend of hell in order to justify its big increase in defense spending. Raghav Kumar Jha's report for DD India.
Meanwhile, on the sidelines of the NATO summit in The Hague, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky met with US President Donald Trump on Wednesday for a long and substantive discussion focused on potential ceasefire in Ukraine. Though not invited to summit's main working session, Zelensky held talks with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte and European leaders including Macron, Meloni, Merz, Starmer. Rutte reaffirmed NATO's support to Ukraine, while Zelensky expressed gratitude for continuing air defense aid, calling the summit a show of strong backing. And to decode the outcome of the NATO summit, joining me is Ambassador Prakash Srivastava, former senior diplomat, former Indian ambassador to Iran and distinguished fellow VIF. Good evening and welcome, Ambassador Srivastava, to DD India. How well has the NATO summit articulated the threats outside and the existing differences within the grouping vis-a-vis the United States?
NATO summit has agreed to hike up the defense spending to 5% of GDP by 2035. That does not necessarily answer the question whether there's a unity of purpose. And that is what has been plaguing NATO. There was a rift in the transatlantic alliance, which has been papered over for the time being. And the NATO allies, the European allies of US, have announced an increase in defense spending as demanded by President Trump. But it raises many questions. Increase in defense spending at a time when the global economy is slowing down and when there's pressure or competition for resources from other agenda like climate change, was it really required? And whether this will be enough to answer the security needs, and does it answer the US security needs? Because unlike European countries whose focus remains Europe, America has global interests and global reach, and its biggest challenge comes from China, which is not part of NATO's mandate. So I think the summit outcome may be satisfying to a few countries, but they don't really answer the questions which the alliance is going to face and more than anyone else, which the US is going to face in next 5 years.
Right. Ambassador Srivastav, you're flagging pertinent issues, and I want to take it a little further. What does it then say about the dynamics, the real dynamics within the NATO grouping? And may I also bring your attention to what has also been highlighted by a lot of media persons about a certain language of flattery that the NATO leadership used for President Donald Trump, almost really trying to address his concerns as a priority for the grouping.
That goes back to NATO leaders' reading of US president. They want to flatter him to keep America in. If you recall the historic origins of NATO, as the saying went, NATO was conceived to keep Russia out, to keep Germany down, and to keep US in. Now the Germany has risen, it was reunited, and today, I mean, in last 6 months, one of the biggest change which has come over is the German commitment to massive increase in its defense spending. Just to put things in perspective, Germany's defense budget as of now, 95 billion euro, outstrips India's defense budget by something like 40% at least. And India has, much bigger and more complex security threats. And to increase that from, the current 2.4% of GDP to 3.4% by 2030 and 5% by 2035 is going to put a lot of strain on that economy. And of course, it will fundamentally change the nature of NATO. One of the tenets, NATO's tenet, which I repeated, was to keep Germany down. Today, Germany has risen, and it is going to rise again.
Right. And what does the outcome of the summit mean for the United States President? And one is, of course, raising the budget to 5% that President Donald Trump had been demanding. But also he makes clear in his address where the military equipment and infrastructure is likely to come from. Made in America, he says.
That is true. Last year, European Commission passed a policy paper, adopted a policy paper, which said that not only EU has to increase its defense spending, it has to be more self-reliant, which means to go it alone. And what America is demanding is that not only you increase defense spending, but you buy more from America. So I think the two will, there's still enough convergence of interest. The two will go together because Europe realizes they can't go it alone.
And the developments in Iran, sir, also echoed at The Hague. NATO chief endorsed American action in Iran. Trump rejected any doubts, aspersions over the real impact of US strikes on Iran. And Iran, meanwhile, is moving to suspend cooperation with the UN Atomic Agency watchdog. How do you see the situation in Iran is likely to evolve from here on?
Let me first make a small comment about where you began the question. There's a lot of speculation whether the US strike
yes.
succeeded in taking out the Iranian nuclear capacity. Now, the underlying assumption is that Iran was moving towards weaponization. This raises two questions. Is that correct? You go back to 2002 debate on Iraq, and Colin Powell, the U.S. Secretary of State, he raised an ampule and supposedly containing some WMD material. And after a costly war and almost a decade of occupation, American forces could not unearth any WMD program. So, underlying assumption that Iran was moving towards weaponization, that itself can be questioned. Second is that even assuming that assumption was correct, there were less costly options to constrain Iran's nuclear program, and that is what Iran had agreed to. Now, this so-called finding or leak from Pentagon should not become an argument for restarting a war in a region which has just undergone a very deadly confrontation.
On that note, Ambassador Dinkar Prakash Srivastav, thank you very much for joining us on DD India and sharing your perspective.
Thank you.